What is up, developers, and welcome back to the channel. In this crash course, I'm going to show you how you can use WordPress as a headless CMS alongside NextJS. This will allow you to use all the powers of WordPress, but the speed of NextJS. By the end of it, you'll be able to request your posts from WordPress and present them using NextJS, and will automatically revalidate, so if somebody updates with a new post, it will automatically be shown to the next end user. This is a great implementation for the developers who want to use NextJS and want to use the Jamstack, but maybe the client they're using or the marketing team they're on want to use a CMS that is user friendly. So if that sounds like something you want to get into, let's get coding. Right, hello, sorry to interrupt, but I just need to get this out here. 50% of you are not subscribed to the channel. That means you're missing out on content. So if you see a red button, click it and let's get on with the video. So welcome to WordPress. You may have seen this hundreds of times and you may have never seen it. So this is currently hosted on a tiny Raspberry Pi, and I'm not going to cover how to install WordPress as a whole, as there's hundreds, if not thousands of tutorials out there. Plus, places like DigitalOcean and other hosting sites allow you to do a one-click install for WordPress. So to get this ready for us to be able to use it as a headless CMS, we need to install a single plugin. Now, bearing in mind, this is for GraphQL, but you could use the REST API that is already available to you, but I just prefer to use GraphQL as it's much more flexible and shows the power of using it versus trying to struggle through making a REST API request out of the box. So to add a new plugin, you're just going to go to Plugins and click Add New. Then we're going to search for a plugin, and it is WP GraphQL. And it will be this one right here, 8,000 active installs, and has like a little elephant at the time of the install. So go ahead, click Install, and then what you will see is it will ask you to activate this WordPress plugin after it's installed. So go ahead, click that, and now you'll see two new icons appear, one at the top and then one down here. So the one in the left nav bar just has extra pieces of settings that you may want to enable or disable depending on your preferred method, and it also gives you the endpoint for your GraphQL, and then changing this could affect the tooling, so go ahead and just leave this as is. Now this top one gives you access to the actual schema and able to create all the different queries that we're going to use in our WordPress crash course. We're going to skip this for now, and we're going to go ahead and do some front end work and then come back. But just to give you an idea, you can basically hit anything that's inside your WordPress installation here. So if you need particular pages, or you need particular posts, or posts by a particular ID, you can do all of that. So now we've got this covered, let's go ahead and open up Visual Studio Code and start working on our Next.js application. So here we are in the Next.js application. You just use the create next app script to create this app. Now all I've done is stripped out the API folder that was here and then moved all of these modules here into the global CSS. And that's all we're going to do from a delete, remove, or move in general. And now we can start coding. So we're going to create a new page here called blog.js. And then we're also going to create a folder here called post. And inside of that post, we're going to create a new file here called slug.js with the square brackets around it. And later, when we get into this file, we'll describe what this is used for. So now we have this blog.js. We need to also include a .env file. And that .env file is just going to handle all of our WordPress URL that we need. So it's just going to be WordPress URL equals and then your GraphQL endpoint. So for me, this is going to be 192.168.4.77 /GraphQL, and then hit save. So now we have the basics of our pages mapped out. We're going to create another folder. I'm going to call this lib. And then inside of that, we're going to create another folder called WordPress. And then outside of the WordPress folder, we're going to create a fetcher.js file. And that's going to handle any of our fetching in general. So if you want to add additional functionality to your website that is outside of the realm of this WordPress course, you can use this fetcher over and over again, and it will provide you with the same results each time. So now we have that. What we need to do is create another file here called api.js. And this is going to handle all of our WordPress API queries that we're going to create through GraphQL. So first, let's create this fetcher. So for this fetcher, we're going to import our newly created WordPress URL here. So we can do a const at the top and say WordPress API equals process.env.wp_URL. So now we have that constant. We can use it wherever we want. So we can just say async function fetcher. Then we're going to pass in a query here, and then we're also going to pass in some variables. And these variables might be something for our query as we extend this out. This could be something like we need the slug, so send in the slug here to return the exact post. And then we're going to close this out and then create our functionality. So we're going to do a response here, and we're going to await the fetch. I'm going to do WP_API because that will be the query URL that we want to use. Then we can do a comma, and because we're doing a post, we also need to include the method, the headers, and the body that we want to send down. So the method here will be post. Then we need headers, and the headers will be an object, and it's going to be content type. And we need a capital T for content type. And then we'll do application/JSON. And then finally, we're going to do the body here. And now the body itself is going to be anything that the query plus the variables. So we can do JSON.stringify query and then comma variables. And then this async function can be used in general anywhere in the application. Then we just need to handle the response, so we can just say JSON await rest.json return JSON, and then let's export this out. So export default fetcher and hit save. So at this point, this async function is going to take in this WordPress URL and any queries and variables and essentially make a request to our endpoint with all that data and then handle what happens in the response. So now we have that. We should think about what kind of queries we want. Now, thinking from a blog standpoint, we're going to need a couple of different things. We're going to need, let's say, 20 posts or 30 posts, or however many posts you want to show on the post page, so that someone can read through and maybe get an idea of what you're doing, and then select that one and use it. And then display that post to the full amount versus just a quick excerpt with the title. So we're definitely going to need at least some way to grab the first 20 posts. We're also going to need a way to get all the slugs for static paths and static generation. And then we're also going to need a way to get the post by a slug. So we can display this to the user. So those are the three queries we're going to definitely need in the beginning. So what we could do now is flip back to the code and let's build out our first one, as that's going to be our blog.js page. And then we can come back, create that, make sure that that is displayed to the user correctly. And then we can start actually making the static generation of paths so that our slug is ready to go. So here we are in our GraphQL IDE, ready to create something for a query. So first, let's call this query all posts. And then inside of that query, we're going to say, we're going to use the posts here and say we're going to need the first 20. So the first 20 posts where, and then we're going to need something by some sort of order maybe, or something like that, so we get them in the right order. So we're going to select order by, and then the field is going to be date, and then we're going to obviously get them in descending order. So that tells the query that we want the first 20 posts where the order by, the date field in descending order. Then we just need what we actually want returned. So from here we can select nodes and say we want the ID. We also want the date. We also want the slug. We need the title. And sure, why don't we just get the excerpt too? So here is our big long query. Pretty on the easy side of GraphQL. And then if we hit this button here, we should see a couple of posts that we have. In fact, we have two. And what you'll notice is this excerpt here actually has HTML built into it because it's being returned from the actual page itself. So when you go into a post here, and we can look at this now and say, okay, this post here, let's click edit. As you can see, this is like a block editor, and the excerpt itself is written as a paragraph. And so that's why it's being returned. And we'll have to handle that in our Next.js application, but it won't be too much extra work for us. And it will just make it easier for the user to decide whether or not they want to see this blog post based upon the excerpt that we write. So now we have that GraphQL query. Let's go ahead and use that in our Next.js application and start creating our blog page. So we're back in our API here. Let's select this API for WordPress, and under this grab first 20 posts, let's write this out again. You can copy and paste it from your GraphQL, but I want to show it one more time. So we're going to call this query all posts. And the query itself needs to be a constant, so we'll call this export const, and then we'll call it all underscore posts, and then it will equal a set of backticks, and then we can write the query itself. So query all posts, and then inside of here we need posts, and then we're going to say first 20 comma where, and then open a set of curly braces and say order by, and then open another set and say field date order descend, and then outside of this part here we're going to open another set of curly braces and say nodes, and then another set of curly braces, and then we need ID date title slug and excerpt. And that is our first query that we have ready to be used in our application. So we can go ahead and hit save here. And then we can go to our blog page and say we want to use that query as a way of generating a static website. So the first thing we need to do is import everything that we need. So we need to import that fetcher that we created. And that's going to come from the lib. And it's going to be called fetcher. And then we need to import that all underscore posts from, and that's also going to come from lib. So that's lib/WordPress/API. And then we should import a link from NextLink so that we can send the user to the page using NextLink. So now we can call this const blog. And then for now, we'll just do a simple query here, and we won't do anything else. And then underneath that, we'll export default blog. And then underneath that, this is where we're going to do our static props. So it's an async function, and it's called get static props. And then what we're going to do here is say const response equals await fetcher, which is obviously our API fetcher here. And then we can paste in our all underscore posts that we put at the top, which is this. Then we can take that response and say const all posts equals response.data.posts.notes. And you're probably wondering how I know that this is going to be the response. And that's because the way that we have this query written out. So if you look at this query, we know that we're looking for posts, and then we're looking for these to be returned. So what's going to be returned is the response, then the data, then posts.nodes, which matches the query. So if you look at the query one more time, if we go back to API, posts and nodes, and that matches this. So that's how I know that that's what's going to be returned. Then we need to say return props, and we want all posts to be available. And then we're going to put something here called revalidate. And what revalidate does is it says, okay, every time somebody visits the website, I need to check to see whether or not revalidation has been done. So in this way, what's happening here is it's saying every second we want to revalidate. Now that doesn't mean it's just going to be pinging the endpoint, because you may only have a few hundred people visit your website, maybe a few thousand, maybe a few 100,000. But once every second, it's going to check to see if there is a new blog post. If there is a new blog post and it needs to be revalidated, so once every second, it will check and compare what you already have. And if there is no new data, nothing will happen. But if there is new data, that will show up for the next user. So it's a way of doing sort of a static site that's also dynamic by offering sort of an extra piece of generation. So now we have this done. Now we actually have to create something to show this all off. So we need to at first put all posts in here so that we can use it in our application. So first I'm going to create a const here called posts. And we're just going to set that to all posts so that I can check to see if this has anything in and return it as needed. I could just leave this and just use the props out of the gate, but I am one person who prefers to do it this way. So now we need to return some stuff. So what we're going to do is do a return here, and we're going to use div, and we're going to give it a class name equal container. And this is provided by Next when you create an application. And I just took everything out of this home module and dropped it into here so that I could use it. So I didn't have to spend a lot of time making it look pretty for you. So now we have that. Then we can create a main, and the class name here will be main. And then we're going to create a div, and the class name here will be grid. And then inside of that grid, we're going to do post.map post. So we're going to map over all of these posts and say, if there's anything there, we're going to return a div with the class name equal to card, and the key will equal post.slug. Then we can do let's close this div out, and then say inside of there we'll do an h3, and the h3 will be post.title. And then inside of that, we need the excerpt. So the way this is going to work is we're actually going to do a self-close tag here. And we're going to set the information to a dangerously set inner HTML. So we can do that by doing a div, and then doing dangerous set inner HTML equal to, and then inside of here we're going to do underscore underscore HTML, and then blog post dot excerpt, and that should give us the p tags without having to actually replace anything or do anything with it. It will just handle it for us here. And then the last piece that we need here is the way for the date to be, so someone knows what date it is. So we'll just do post.date. And then finally, we'll do a button to link out to our actual blog post. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to set a URL to /post/ $post.slug. And then we'll close that out, and we'll say inside of this link, we'll do an A, and we'll say read more. And we hit save and let it fix everything. And then we just make sure that we haven't missed anything here. I don't believe we have. I think everything is good. So now we can go ahead and hit save. I'm going to launch this, and I'll meet you in the website showing you what the blog looks like. So here we are on localhost 3000/blog. And as you can see here, we have the title, a new blog post. We have the excerpt, an excerpt of text, the date, and the read more option that we can select. And if we click this right now, we'll get an error message saying that the default export is not a React component. And that's because we haven't built this page out, but everything works as expected. So that's a good start. Like, we have everything that we need to display these through WordPress to our end users through NextJS. So let's go back to the code and actually build out the Slug page, which is going to handle displaying everything to the user. So we're back in the code now, and we need to import a few things first and talk about how this page actually works, because it's being dynamically generated and it's not just a page that you can go to. So first, let's import a few things. We're going to import fetcher, and that's going to come from the lib folder, and that lib folder is going to have the fetcher in. And then we're going to import use router, and that's going to come from next/router. And then we're going to create a const here called post, and we're not going to pass anything in right now, but at least we have the function here, and then we're going to export that function out. So now we have the basics of a simple next page, but now we need to talk about how this works. So I'm going to create two other functions here. We're going to have a function called getStaticPaths, and then one other one called getStaticProps, which you've seen previously. So now we have these two. Let's talk about how this works. So the way that this page works is this getStaticPaths creates every path that is available at the time that it is built. So imagine you had 10,000 URLs for your blog post. You've been writing blogs forever. You have so many pages. What this will do is we'll create a function here that goes and gets all the posts, and then we'll produce a path for each one of those. So let's say our path is hello world. We'll be able to create a path here that is /post/hello world, or /James's latest blog post, or whatever that might be. It will create this path for you so that you have it. So when you click on it, you'll be able to go to it and it will be fast and loaded immediately versus actually going out, getting all the data and where it is located, and then bringing it back here. So we need to create two more GraphQL queries here. One is going to get all of our posts based upon just returning the slug. And then the other one is actually going to get our post data. So I'm actually just going to write out our get all slugs for static paths for static generation right here without having to go to our GraphQL endpoint. So it's going to be called get all posts with slug. And we're going to equal this to some backticks. And then inside the backticks, we're going to have a set of curly braces. And we're going to say posts first. And we're just going to ask for the first 10,000 posts. And then we're just going to say nodes. And all we want is the slug. And that's it. That's all we want. So all we need is the slug. And that will give us the ability to handle this part of our function. So now we need to work on the other part, which is the getStaticProps, which is essentially going to get our post by slug using a query so that we can pass in something and get the data back. So I'll meet you back on our WordPress admin site in the GraphQL IDE where we can create this. So we're back in our IDE here. So let's create a new query and we'll call this post by slug. And we're going to need to pass in something here, but for now, we're not going to do anything. So what we're going to do is we're going to click this button here and say post. And automatically you can see that this was filled in the query, post, ID, and then an empty string, which is true. We're actually going to do that. And then we're going to also include this ID type, which tells it what we want. So we want the slug. So essentially what we're saying here is we're going to pass in an ID, which will be a slug. And then we're going to want something returned based upon that. So what we can do now is say, okay, what do I want back? And what is important here for our user to be able to read our information. So what we're going to need, obviously, is we're going to need the title. We're going to need also the slug. We're also probably going to need the date. We're also going to need the actual content, and this will be everything that it is. And you can have the raw or rendered version, but we're just going to ask for the content and it will send down the raw version. And then we also probably are going to need the featured image. So you're going to select feature image here, node, and then source URL. And this is if your user has a image, and then you can select the size as you wish, but we're not actually going to do that. We're just going to leave it as is because we can just handle that on our side. And then that would be all that we need for us to create something for our blog posts. So if I pass in a slug here, and a slug would be, I believe, hello world is a slug, and hit the query button, you can see here that this is what's being returned. Here is the content. Here is the title, the slug, the date. The featured image is null because we don't have one. So this query works and it's ready to go, but we need to actually change the query slightly so that we can use variables down here in the query variable section versus having to hard code this in here. So what you can do with GraphQL, if you've never used it before, is you can do something like this. So you can open up a set of parentheses and tell it that you're going to send in something called ID. So this is the variable name, and then this is the type of variable that it is. And then we're also going to tell it that we're going to send in the ID type. And the ID type is post ID type. And then we can close these up. And now you'll see that it's angry that, like, this is never used by our operation because we're hard coding these. So what we can do then is just say this here is going to be this variable. So change this from that to a $sign plus the word ID. And then this one will be the $sign ID type. And that's it. Now if we run this query, you'll get this error message saying variable ID required and was not provided. And then, you know, this version was not provided. So now we know that if we pass in variables in our code or through here, that this query will work. So let's take this back to Visual Studio Code and I'll show you how you can use this in our application. So now we're back in the code again and we're on our API page, and this API page is going to have one more query here. We'll call it export const post by slug, and then we can just put equals, add some backticks, and then we can paste it in the query. And what I did was I just changed the name from my query to post by slug so I know which query is what. So if we hit save here, this is now ready to be used and we can post in these variables. Now, if you remember correctly, in the fetcher itself, we have a query and variables here. So what we can do is in our get static props, actually send in these variables here and we'll use them in the query and that will return the data that we want. So inside of our slug here, we need to do this get static paths first, and then we need to do this static props. So what we're going to do is take our queries that we wrote and import them at the top. So the first query will be import get all posts with slug. I believe that's what we called it. Let's just check. Get all posts with slug. Or post with slug, yep. And then we need post by slug, and then we're going to import those from ////////////// API. So now we can use this in our queries here. So the get static paths is the first one we'll write. So to do that, all we're going to do is say const response equals await fetcher, and then pass in get all posts with slug. Then we're going to ask it to take those and say all posts equals await response dot data.posts.nodes. And again, just in case you've forgotten how I know that that's what that's going to be, if you look at this API, the first one is posts and then nodes, and we want this part, so posts and nodes. And that matches here, posts and nodes. So now we can say, okay, return, and we're going to need paths, and those paths are going to be every single post and its path. So we're going to call it allposts.map, and then we're going to map in the posts, and we're going to say, for that, we're going to map it and say each post is going to be post slash $post.slug or empty array. If it fails, we'll have an empty array. And then we're going to say fallback is false, as we don't want the fallback to actually be used here. And then we can hit save, and that is our get static paths done. And if you're wondering about any of this, I have covered this quite a few different times, and you can check out the video on get static paths and get static props. But this query will create every single post on build time ready to be used, and it will be lightning fast. So now we have that, we need the get static props to actually be usable. So we're going to pass in some params here. And the way that this works is we're going to create a variables here. And these variables are what we're going to pass in to this post by slug. So const variables equals an object, and the object is going to have the ID and the ID type. And those were the query parts of our API here, ID and ID type. So the ID is going to be from the params.slug, and the ID type will be a string called slug. So there are our variables. Then we can use these variables to actually make the request. So we can say const data equals await fetcher post by slug variables, and that will send in our post by slug query with the variables that we created here, and that will return back our post data. So then we can do return and say props, and then we can say post data and hit save. So now what we have is the ability to take in a slug that will be passed from our page. So when we click this button here, there's our post slug. So it knows that that's what we're going to be using. And it's going to say, hey, we're going to use that as our parameter. We're going to look for this slug that's being passed in, and then we're going to make this request and get the post data that we can use up here in our post section. So now what we can do is take this and say post data, and then inside of here we can actually start just making our blog posts. So what I'll do is I'll do a const here called blog post that takes the post data.post and handles that part. And if you're wondering again, just to reiterate, post, and then that will be what we're looking for. So if you base it on this, query in our slug one more time, post data is the name of the variable, then it's the data, and then the post. So that's what we're going to have available to us. Then we're going to need the router that we passed in here and say if the router is fallback, and there is no blog post .slug. So essentially what we're saying here is if the router is not, so if this is not true and this is not there, then we should just return an error page and say status equals 404, and that's it. And what we could do here, I'm just creating this for you, which you can extend. But essentially what this does is allows you to use a custom error page if this happens, instead of just showing nothing to the user on the screen or dumping out a stack trace. So now we have that. Now we can actually do our true return here and say we want a div, and then we're going to say if the router is fallback, Then we're going to say div. Nope, that's not what we asked for you to do. There we go. And just say, we'll just say it's loading for now. And then we can do the or here and say or. And let's do a div. And inside of this div, we can do dangerously set again. So it's just the word dangerously set inner HTML equal to HTML blog post dot content, which is this blog post dot content, and then we can close this out and then just hit save, and we can just do a quick test to make sure this works, and then we can come back and add like a title and everything else. So in theory, this should now produce what we want. So I'll meet you back on our web page and I'll show you exactly how it works. So here we are back on our blog page, and this read more button should allow us to go to post/hello world. So let's click the button, and as you can see, this has worked. And I did add a heading here and some bold words to show you that immediately, without making any changes, all we did was set a div. We can see that these now are an H2. This is a paragraph that has strong tags attached to it, and this is a regular paragraph. So everything's working as expected. Then we can just add a heading and then a featured image, and your blog would be ready to show the world. So let's quickly just add a few things there, and then this crash course will be done. So we're back in the code here, and we can add an H1 at the top, and this H1 will be the blog post.title, and then save here, and then make sure that everything is wrapped in a div so that we don't have any fragments, and then hit save. And then let's flick back and check to make sure this is showing correctly. Okay, so we've returned, and now you can see that this hello world has appeared, and this should be the H1 that we have requested. So everything is working as expected, and now what you could do to extend this out is use next image to handle your featured images. So this is the end of the crash course, and I've shown you how you can use WordPress as a headless CMS. Obviously, I'm going to upload this to GitHub, and feel free to extend it as needed. But this just shows you how powerful WordPress is and how quickly you can set up a blog just using a few pieces of NextJS and using the power of get static paths and props to make it lightning fast. Now make sure if you did enjoy this video to throw a thumbs up, subscribe if you're not already, and hit that notification bell so that you know when the next available crash course or video from me goes live.